Christy, thank you so much for coming on the Easy Prey podcast today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So, can you give myself and the audience a little bit of background about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I'm a registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, and journalist covering food, nutrition, and health. And I specialize in covering disordered eating and helping people recover from disordered eating. Having had my own background with disordered eating and eating disorders over the years. I have two podcasts. Rethinking Wellness is the newest one, and Food Psych, which both are dedicated to dismantling diet and wellness culture and helping people sort of see through some of the scams and misinformation that's out there. And I have a new book that's just out called The Wellness Trap, and that delves into these ideas further as well.
Awesome. We got a lot to talk about today. So, how did you get into the field?
Yeah, so like I said, I had my own history with disordered eating and eating disorders. I have been a journalist for more than 20 years. And when I got out of school and started my career as a journalist, I was struggling with my own eating disorder and was really obsessed with food and nutrition and health because I was struggling with that stuff myself. And I wasn't eating enough. I was restricting my food. And so I became obsessed with food and wanting to know everything that's in it. And also, like, wanting to report on delicious food and how food is grown and just know everything there is to know about food. And so that's kind of what led me into my career focusing on food, nutrition, and health in the first place, but was nowhere on my radar to focus on disordered eating. And I wasn't a dietitian, wasn't trained in that. My undergraduate degrees were sort of geared towards journalism, rhetoric, and French literature. It's like nothing to do with science really. But I, over the years, was reporting on food, nutrition, and health, and quoting a lot of sources who were dietitians, who were professionals working in the nutrition space, and really became curious and interested in doing what they did. And at the time, my perspective was wanting to help end the quote unquote obesity epidemic. Now I've come to see that as a really stigmatizing term and sort of a problematic objective. But at the
Hmm.
time, that was really where my head was, and I was really into like Michael Pollan and the sort of food movement, sustainability. And I applied to go back to school to study public health and nutrition at NYU to be able to study with Marion Nestle, who's sort of like the godmother of that movement. And so I went into it from that space. But in my work, my studies in school, I started to learn about research methods and started to see some of the holes and really wide gaps in nutrition research between what the research actually said and what people were recommending and what we're even learning in our dietetics classes, and started to kind of see the problems with that. And I also started working at the city department of health in nutrition education programs, and I was working with participants in my programs who were starting, like, I personally, I was in recovery at the time. I was in like an early stage of eating disorder recovery, but professionally I was working with these participants who were, like my star participants were kind of doing the things that I was doing in my most disordered days of my relationship with food. They were getting really obsessive. They were like walking miles and miles to get to the program. They were, cutting out more foods and, avoiding things and sort of going down these rabbit holes. And I was like, oh, wow, it was sort of a cognitive dissonance moment of seeing what people were doing that seemed harmful and that reminded me of stuff that I had done in my most disordered days when I was in a process of recovery. I had discovered intuitive eating. I was starting to really reconnect with my body and sort of allow all foods and not be so obsessive and hung up on what was in my food. And so it really was this grappling that I had to do with, like, wow, if I'm doing this, to heal myself, and then I'm transmitting this information to people that's kind of leading them into a disordered space like I was, do I really want to be doing that? And is this really the right fit for me? And I
Yeah.
started to get interested in disordered eating from that lens, of looking into how to help other people recover and heal from disordered relationships with food. And I discovered in that process that intuitive eating and sort of an anti-diet approach was really the gold standard for eating disorder recovery, but also prevention. And that doing work in that space could be a way to help prevent eating disorders at a larger scale. So that's what led me to start doing the work that I ended up, ultimately making the focus of my career. And it's been really interesting and fulfilling for the last 10 years or so to get into that work.
That's cool. That's really interesting. I know one of the things that we talked about before we started recording is um, we're kind of medical food tangent and try to be aware of appropriate disclaimers and whatnot. So I know that you have a standard disclaimer that you use when you're talking. Could you share that with us?
Sure. Yeah. So my standard disclaimer is, this is intended for informational and educational purposes only. This is not a substitute for medical or mental health advice and doesn't constitute a provider patient relationship. So, I'm talking to you on this podcast just for information, not as anybody's individual dietitian.
Perfect. So let's talk a little bit about kind of how we got here in a sense. I know that, and I don't know if this is a U.S. centric thing, but since we're both in the U.S., we'll talk about it as if it were a U.S. centric issue. Like, what is the cultural obsession with diet? Like, where did you know where that originated?
Yeah, it has a lot of interesting roots and sort of this tangled root system, I think, that I talk about in my first book, Anti Diet. So, one of those roots goes back all the way to like Greek antiquity of, sort of demonizing certain foods and elevating others, making certain foods out to be kind of associated with groups that are seen as lesser and other foods are associated with groups that are seen as better, and food as sort of this way to like differentiate yourself, but also the notion that what you eat is really tied up with health, that like you are what you eat. All of that sort of goes back to that Greek antiquity place. um, but interestingly, at that time, there was a little bit of discussion around body size, but it wasn't the sort of demonization of larger bodies that we came to see later. It was more this idea of like balance was the thing to strive for and achieve, and bodies weren't considered to be better if they were thinner. In fact, being too thin was seen as a problem, but being too large was also seen as a problem. So there was some anti-fat bias there, but it was never sort of as intense as it is now, I think. And really, where we started to see that intense anti fat bias come in was in the 17 and 1800s around the slave trade.
Mm.
And so there's a scholar named Sabrina Strings who wrote a book called Fearing the Black Body, who's done a lot of really interesting work around this, showing that anti fat bias really sort of came up around the same time as people were trying to figure out reasons to justify slavery. And so seeing larger bodies as bad and as being sort of associated with Black folks and people who are in marginalized groups was a way to like, to differentiate between different races and to say people in thinner bodies are better, and being larger bodied was associated with blackness and therefore was bad. And so there was really a lot of explicit rhetoric around the time of in like women's magazines and stuff saying that you don't want to look like an African, so like lose weight and slim your body. And it was really just outrageously racist. And it's become that aspect of it, I think, has gone really underground. But as she describes in the book, it's still there in these sort of subtler ways in contemporary culture. But I think it started to become that doctors got caught up in this
Mhm.
notion that larger bodies were bad. So up until that point, really, doctors hadn't seen fatness as necessarily a health related thing. It was more of like a cosmetic issue that doctors didn't tend to address because they thought, well, this is just, people gain weight as they age. There's nothing wrong with it. Like that's sort of a cosmetic thing that's taking you away from the deeper, health issues that you should be attending to. And so, there's evidence that doctors were sort of frustrated by people's desire to diet and lose weight that started to come up around the mid to late 1800s.
Mhm.
But then, sort of towards the turn of the century, of the 20th century, it really started to become prevalent that doctors were getting into the game of weight loss and starting to recommend it and starting to say that there are health problems from being higher weight. And, Sabrina Strings' work and also the work of a scholar named Amy Erdman Farrell really points to the fact that doctors were kind of like giving people what they wanted, like that people were starting to demand diets because it was starting to become this cultural trend, this cultural sort of imperative to be smaller, especially like for white middle class people, especially. And so, doctors started to kind of cave to that demand and give the people what they wanted. And then then research started emerging, this early research, such as it was, started emerging that linked higher weight to poor health outcomes, but it was really based on this sort of underlying anti-fat bias that was there. And from there, insurance companies kind of seized on that, and the diet industry really took off with like the advent of industry in general in the US, right? The Industrial Revolution brought like a lot more advertising and sort of different companies and products into the mix. And that's where we started to see a lot of these really like scammy products of supposed weight loss pills and tapeworms and devices that really didn't work and caused harm. And all of these things, this diet industry started to explode. By like the 1920s, it was really rampant. And ever since then, it's kind of like increased year after year, decade after decade, so that now in the US, the diet industry is something like $72 billion
Wow.
market. And, around the world, it's far greater. It's in the hundreds of billions. And so I think it kind of perpetuates itself, so that like we've now had like several generations come up with this really steeped in anti-fat bias, and with the prevalence of the diet industry and with medical recommendations for weight loss. And the thin ideal tends to get thinner and thinner over time, or these days it's like thin and sort of esoteric, like you're supposed to have certain body parts are supposed to be big and others are supposed to be small, right? And it's a lot of surgeries involved. So it's constantly shifting and changing. This supposed ideal of beauty is constantly out of reach for the vast majority of people. And so I think that helps perpetuate it as well, that there's always something that you're supposed to feel bad about and always someone there to like sell you the supposed solution.
Yeah, I think to me, with lots of industries, there's I don't know, I like to tell people to follow the money. Who's
Mm-hmm.
profiting off of, who's benefiting from you acting or doing something specific. And it's scary when you see weight loss industry in the, what did you say, $70 billion,
Mm-hmm.
hundreds of billions of dollars worldwide. There's like, okay, there's a lot of motivation for them to make money from people who don't know what's going on, or,
Mm-hmm.
well, let's just get our money and get out of this game as quickly as we can.
Totally.
So we were talking from like the 1700s all the way up to the 2000s. What were some of the kind of the wackiest weight loss things that have happened over that 300-year period?
Oh my, yeah, where to start? It's interesting to think about how like there's nothing new under the sun. Like a lot of what we do today is sort of iterating on past ideas, So there was like the first blockbuster diet book, actually, the first best-selling diet book was by this guy named William Banting, who was like an undertaker who decided to try to lose weight, and that was at a time when weight loss wasn't really prevalent, when doctors weren't really in the weight loss game, but he found a doctor. He kind of went from doctor to doctor, found a doctor who gave him a sort of austere weight loss diet, and then wrote a book about the process and about the diet. And it was basically like an Atkins diet
Hmm.
with a whole bunch of alcohol added. It was
Oh,
like, meat and fat and alcohol and very little else. And it's interesting how, that sort of low carb trend has cycled through over the years. It became popularized again by Atkins in the 70s and then in the 90s. And then, now more recently, like the keto trend is sort of building on that or taking it in a slightly different direction, but still all low carb based. There's paleo, there's like caveman, all of that stuff is sort of just an iteration on this early low carb diet that was a trend. You see calorie counting emerged in like the early 1900s and early or 19 teens, and that's cycled through too. So many diets over the years have been about reducing calories, counting calories, but it shape shifts kind of as time goes on. So it's points, it's macros, it's this, it's that, right? It's traffic light, but it's all sort of based on that same idea of calorie counting. There's stuff that's like truly wild and wacky, like tapeworms, like I
yeah.
mentioned, or the vibrating belts that were supposed to make fat melt off, or just ridiculous cleanses and detoxes. And we see a lot of those still to this day. Different iterations of detoxes and stuff. But yeah, it's all sort of a piece, when you think about like people, some people think, well, it's reasonable to count calories or it's reasonable to cut carbs in a way that maybe it's not reasonable to take a tapeworm or something
Yeah.
like that. But it is all sort of coming from this same place of, demonizing larger bodies, seeing them as bad and shameful, telling people that, they don't know what to eat and that, they need to do a certain thing and sort of follow some guru or someone who supposedly has the answers to tell them what's really healthy, when the sort of basic building blocks of nutrition, the stuff that's like really boring and doesn't involve cutting out foods or food groups, just sort of, it doesn't have that same kind of appeal, right? And I think today, especially with social media and the way that that amplifies the most controversial, the most
Yeah.
extreme content, and to be able to keep people liking and clicking and sharing, because that's what maximizes engagement and makes the industry money, right? Makes the platforms money. Like, again, follow the money. When you think about what sells on social media, it's going to be those extreme things. And so I think there's been this huge proliferation of just wild trends and things on TikTok that are super obviously problematic, and not even necessarily just TikTok, right? Other social media as well. There's best-selling books that claim that drinking almost nothing but celery juice for part of the day at least is going to cure all ills. All of these things that sort of purport to be cure-alls, I think, are really things to watch out for too.
Yeah, so let's talk about kind of the things to watch out for. So we've got claims that if I drink 14 pounds of celery juice a day, everything's going to be magical. So what are the warning signs in how something is being communicated, or how we're being educated about something that we should be that should trigger us to say, something's not right here?
Yeah, totally. I think, one pill to cure all ills, that sort of notion that there's one thing, it doesn't have to be a pill, but if it's juice or if it's a diet or if it's a certain protocol or whatever, that it's going to cure this disparate array of things that have nothing to do with each other on the surface, right? So I have multiple chronic health conditions in a variety of arenas. I have autoimmune conditions, digestive conditions, skin issues, hormonal issues. And, there's so many wellness diets and programs that claim to address all of those disparate areas that can be so appealing for anyone who's struggling with those things, because in many cases the conventional healthcare system doesn't have a lot of great answers for things that are sort of more nebulous, or for a wide variety of different things. They're not going to have one thing that can address them all. It might be sort of a large array of different things you might have to do, and certain things don't have great treatments. And so it really preys on, I think, people's desire for help and the lack of support that they're getting from conventional healthcare. So I think if you see something that is claiming to address these, wildly disparate conditions with one intervention, that's one thing to really watch out for. Also, if it's claiming to, if it's preying on your feelings of being dismissed or unheard by the conventional healthcare system, right? And using that sort of truth that there are issues with mainstream medicine, but twisting that into like a sales pitch and saying,
Is this
doctors
like
don't
the
want you to know, right?
Yeah.
The sort of conspiratorial tone of it too is another thing to watch out for. So doctors don't want this secret to longevity, or here's the thing that they're not teaching in medical schools, but I've figured out in my research, and I'm going to tell you for $49.95 or whatever it is, or for $1,200. Like, oftentimes these are extremely high price tags that you're seeing too. Um, it's not necessarily true that anyone who's selling anything is out to get you or anything
Yeah.
like that, because we live in capitalism. Like, people have to sell things. But I think if their sales pitch is based on fear and is preying on ways that you're not getting the help you need in conventional healthcare, I think that's a real red flag. Um, and I think it's only natural for people to be attracted to those sorts of things. But if you see someone doing those kind of pitches and they don't have good credentials, they don't have kind of recognized medical credentials, I think that's another red flag to look out for. Granted, again, the healthcare system is not perfect by any means. There are real problems with it. And if someone is like, well, like the medical medium is like, I have it on authority from a spirit that
Yeah.
this celery juice is going to cure all ills. Science hasn't caught up with what I have to say. That's a real red flag too, right? If it's like, well, there's no science there because we're just so cutting edge that we know what science doesn't know or something like that. This notion of like cutting edge research, the latest research, um, you know, the newest, coolest, interesting thing that nobody else knows. Um, every so often there is something that really is cutting edge and that really is going to be helpful, but those things are very few and far between, I would say, compared to how many interventions and practices and diets are being, positioned as like this is the new great thing.
And they're going to be peer reviewed and they're going to have studies to back it up, not just
Right.
anecdote. And maybe this is something to talk about, the difference between anecdotal evidence and peer reviewed clinical trials where people have done the
Mm-hmm.
research. Is that
Totally.
kind of where we get into trouble? Is we see the really, really fit guy or girl who's in the gym, 8 hours a day, and they say, hey, you can look like me by
Mm-hmm.
doing what I do, when the reality is, well, we're probably not going to be able to look like you.
Right. There's probably a lot of genetic destiny going on there. And yeah, people are using their sort of natural, conventional attractiveness or whatever it is to sell products when, in some cases, they don't necessarily even use the products, right? They're paid to promote the products, and that's not what made them look the way they do. There's a lot of sort of unattainable stuff that goes into that, right? Yeah. And I think, so social media really amplifies anecdotal information and privileges that because of that sort of amplification of the extreme, the novel, the stuff that, they don't want you to know, right? If it's
Yeah.
like, if it seems sort of too good to be true, probably is. And it's probably going to go viral. It's probably going to be something that's really popular on social media. And so, that's one place I think where the anecdotal information and sort of supposed anecdotal evidence proliferates. But I think even in scientific evidence, there's a need to be sort of a critical thinker and not just take anything with the veneer of science as truth. And in fact, there's research showing that people who have a broad trust in science, who say, they generally trust science as opposed to being critical consumers of science, those people who have that broad trust in science are actually more likely to be duped by scientific sounding misinformation. So I think it's important to really be aware of like the differences between observational studies, animal studies, cell studies, studies in computer models,
Yeah.
all of which can provide, maybe some interesting jumping off points for scientists who are looking to do research on clinical interventions in humans, but can't really tell you anything about causation
Yeah.
or, what's going to, and, in the case of like animal and cell studies, what happens in those trials is going to be very different than what happens in the human body. For observational data, which is looking at like large groups of people and seeing, there's higher risk for X disease in people who eat more of Y food or whatever. Those also can't tell you anything about correlation, about causation. They're only
Yeah.
correlation, right? They tell you, okay, well, this behavior is correlated with this outcome, but there's a lot of other things that can explain both the behavior and the outcome, right? Like income level or education or, access to certain things. And so yeah, looking at, that kind of evidence also with a skeptical eye and saying, okay, well, correlation is not causation. Show me the randomized controlled trials. Show me the studies, multiple well-conducted studies in large groups of people by scientists who don't have financial interest in the outcomes too. That's another
Yeah.
important
Follow the
key,
money.
right? Exactly. Follow the money. And again, just because something is funded by a company doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. But I think, in general, scientific research that's funded by pharmaceutical companies, for example, or supplement companies or diet companies tends to have outcomes that are more favorable to that product or practice. So, if there's sort of early evidence that is funded by an interested party, it's important for other scientists who don't have those interests to replicate the study and see, okay, do those results hold up? And if they do, then yeah, like vaccine trials, for example, like those have a lot of robust evidence behind them from parties that are not interested, that don't,
Yeah.
haven't been paid by pharmaceutical companies or whatever, but also, um, you know, other types of trials like things, supplements, vitamins, things like that. I see a lot of, unfortunately, um, industry funded trials that are then being used to tout the benefits of
Yeah.
something and say this is the next be all end all and the miracle pill and everybody should take this. And it's important to be skeptical of that.
Well, and then there also seems to be these series of, not being in the industry, there seems to be a series of studies. That's two categories I hear an awful lot. Uh, a glass of wine is good for you. A glass of wine is bad for you. It seems like every 3 or 4 years it flip flops, and the
Mm-hmm.
same thing with a cup of coffee. It seems to flip flop.
Yep.
So I think there may be even, I don't know if it's correlation or causation issues, but
Yeah.
even when you have studies that seem to be realistic and valuable and not particularly funded by interested parties, the science and a bunch of stuff doesn't really seem to be completely established yet.
Yeah. Well, and that's the problem with a lot of nutrition research is that it is observational in nature. So it's looking at, large groups of people, populations, and saying, okay, among people who drink a cup of coffee a day, what are the outcomes? And, you can there's a cohort that has a certain outcome that's good, and then a different cohort years later that has a different outcome that's not so good. And journalists and health reporters will seize on that stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
speaking as one myself, and especially as someone who, in my own disordered eating days, I was so desperate to find what was going to help and, the sort of perfect diet and stuff. So I was like chasing down that information with such zeal. And I think a lot of health and nutrition reporters do. They really want to, and also there's financial incentives, right? Too, that like those are sort of the articles that get clicked and shared and go viral a lot is things that are sort of fear mongering or unexpected or, make people think like, okay, what I've been eating is all wrong,
Yeah.
or look, this is justification for what I've been doing. And I'm going to like hold it over my friends and family who don't like what I'm doing. It's like sort of perfectly designed to go viral in today's media environment. So looking skeptically at those kind of headlines too, and not taking any of that stuff with too much seriousness, taking it all with a grain of salt.
Gotcha. So are there situations or things that we do to ourselves that make us more susceptible to these type of marketing, fad diets, and commercials for that matter?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because there's a lot of systematic and systemic issues with this. So I think it's not all down to the individual. I
Hmm.
think there are things that we can do certainly to be more skeptical or to be less vulnerable to that stuff. And there are systemic changes that need to be made, like, more regulation on what can be shared on social media and holding tech companies perhaps accountable for things that go viral that are misinformation that harm
Hmm.
people, or regulating supplement companies, regulating other branches of so-called alternative medicine, which is, certainly a problematic thing because regulation could legitimize them in some way. And, there are all these sort of unproven, untested things out there and, providers who are maybe trying to do good, but are leading people very far astray. And,
Hmm.
that's sort of part of the system that people can fall into. And so I think there's like regulation and sort of legislative changes that need to happen to protect people. And at the individual level, there are also things that we can do to protect ourselves. So I think one is just sort of being default skeptical of health and wellness information. I think that's a helpful stance to take, unless it's, coming from a doctor, a medical provider that you have a good relationship with, that you trust, who knows you and knows your history. Someone on the internet, even if they do have an MD, for example, even if they're like a doctor influencer, but they're just saying something on TikTok, that's for informational and educational purposes only. That's
Yeah.
not, an individual consultation from someone who really knows you. And so I think before we act on any of that information that we see out there, just sort of taking a moment to pause. I really love the acronym SIFT, which was developed by Mike Caulfield, who's a researcher at the University of Washington who studies information literacy. And that stands for stop, identify the source, find other coverage, and trace claims, quotes, and media back to their original context. And stop is such a great first step because
Yeah.
it's just like, okay, don't click buy, don't act, don't change your diet, don't overhaul your life based on this piece of information. Take a step back and like quarantine that information. Don't spread it around, and look into it and see what's really there. investigate the source is, finding out what are the credentials of this person, what is their financial interest, what do they stand to gain from spreading this information, and even if they stand to gain something, are they also a legitimate member of like a scientific or medical community who's based on doing things based on evidence, or are they kind of out there in the weeds, basing their recommendations on like animal studies or early stage research, or correlational data and not causation. So investigating the source and sort of what their reputation is too. What do other reputable sources have to say about them? Find other coverage or find better coverage in some cases, means looking at what reputable sources say about this claim. Is this really out there on the fringes, or is this something that's like a matter of serious debate scientifically, or is this established fact that is backed up by pretty much any health agency and an authority that you could think of? That's important to know. If it's something that's way out there on the fringes, I say oftentimes it's the best to just let it go, like not pursue it any further, right? And then finally, tracing claims, quotes, and media back to their original context means looking at, if they are making scientific sounding claims, does that hold water? We don't all have time to check, like fact check everything we come
Yeah.
across. And I think if you're thinking about changing your diet or your lifestyle, or, engaging in some wellness practice, it's probably a good idea to do a little bit more research and dig a little deeper before adopting it, right? You wouldn't, just buy a car sight unseen or
Yeah.
without like test driving it, right? So you want to probably dig in a little bit to get some information about of health and wellness practice you're thinking of trying. And when you trace those claims and quotes back to their original context, is it totally being taken out of context? Is there actually scientific backing there, or is it like sort of phantom science? Sometimes
Mhm.
I see influencers will put in a citation or a link, and then you click the link and it goes to something that's like a study that has nothing to do with what the claim is saying, or maybe it has a little bit to do with it, but it's totally not supporting the claim, or it's the influencer is like way out ahead of their skis on making an interpretation of it. So just making sure that whatever supposed evidence is there is real and accurate and valid. And if any of those things don't check out, when you do your SIF check, I think just letting it go and walking away is the best possible thing you could do. If you find that there's some emotional pull to it, even after you've done a little SIF check, and I think that's common, especially for people who, feel like they're not getting a lot of good answers from their healthcare providers. So they want to do their own research and they want to figure out what's going to work for them. I think just checking in with yourself about that emotional pull and thinking about like, what is it that I really want here? What is the sort of underlying goal of this, trying to follow this claim? Is it that I need actually empathy and support from my care providers? Is it that I am experiencing symptoms and I want some relief from that? And can I, pursue that in a way that's not sort of as potentially scammy or harmful as this, claim is making it out to be? Or, is it preying on my fear? Is it, trying to whip up like fear and anxiety and negative emotions in me in order to sell me something? And if so, then, that's a sign of manipulation, and probably not a good idea to trust the person who's doing that. Right.
So kind of the sort of thing like if this is resonating with me because it's going to get results really fast, that should be a kind of a red flag.
Right. Because what's the desire for speed really about?
Yeah.
Of course, we want
Why
relief
is that?
from
Yeah.
symptoms and pain and things like that. And I think in many cases, the things that are promising, like you'll drop X pounds in X days, or you'll experience a total shift overnight when you do this thing. It's just preying on people's sort of desire for relief and the lack of relief that they've found thus far.
Hmm.
And you know, unfortunately, a lot of real evidence-based self-care practices and health promoting practices tend to take longer and tend to be a little bit more incremental, and don't have this sort of magic pill um, scenario that happens where you start doing it and overnight you feel better, or within a matter of months. Also, conversely, there's wellness purveyors and practitioners who will say, well, if you feel worse, it's working. because,
Oh.
it has to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah.
And, there's a grain of truth to that for some things, right? Like certain conditions, you have like a bacterial infection and you're taking antibiotics for it. In some cases, there will be like this sort of flare up and you'll feel worse for like 24 hours before you feel better or something. But, outside of those kind of unique scenarios, it's generally not the case that if something is helping you, it's going to make you feel a lot worse before you feel better. So, and that's especially true if it's going on for like weeks and months and they're just saying, well, you're still detoxing. You're still, you need to get this out of your system. Look, your skin is purging. It's, breaking out because you're like shedding all these toxins. And it's like, no, actually, something else is probably going on there to cause that kind of a reaction. It's not actually true that people will have, months and months of feeling terrible if something is working.
Yeah, I could understand if I've been eating a tremendous amount of sugar and I go down to a very low amount of sugar, that it's going to cause me to be irritated for a little while my body adjusts to that. But I wouldn't expect to feel bad about that for months or years at a time.
Well, and with sugar, it's an interesting thing actually, because I think a lot of the anti sugar rhetoric is like this very restrictive diety thing, actually, because of course, in general, like eating nothing but sugar
Yeah.
probably isn't great for your health. And, what are the reasons that people might be drawn to that kind of a pattern? Oftentimes it's because they've been restricted of sugar and they're in this restrict binge cycle where they're like, feeling deprived and like they can't get it ever. And so they feel out of control when they eat it and they eat really large amounts and stuff. So, if you're like doing something that's like a sugar detox or, giving up processed foods or something like that, I would say question the premise of it in the first
Mhm.
place, right? Do you really need to give it up entirely? Do you really need to, restrict yourself to that degree? Or is this something that's causing you a lot more restriction that's then exacerbating things and triggering a sort of binge restrict cycle and making you feel out of control with those foods? In general, my practice is intuitive eating. And I think in general that approach really allows for all foods to fit, for people to have anything they want and to not be at war with themselves over food and to not have foods that are off limits and that they feel guilty and ashamed about. And when you can really sort of embrace that philosophy, which is hard, I think, especially in this culture, so it takes a lot of, time and practice and support. But if you can get to that place where you're not feeling like anything is off limits, often it's really easy to just feel like, oh, yeah, I only want a little bit of that, or I'm going to have some of that and I can walk away and I'm not going to like feel compelled to finish the whole bag or whatever it is.
Is that where we kind of get into trouble with diets and which results in the yo-yoing is like, okay, well the diet says I can't have sugar, but I really wanted it, so I ate a cookie. Well,
Mm-hmm.
I've already eaten one cookie. I might as well now eat, the whole bag or the whole box, or I'm just gonna eat
Totally.
40 of them. Let's exaggerate here. Um, and then it's like all the negative emotions and everything kind of just piles on from that.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. There's this sort of like, well, screw it all. I've already broken the diet anyway, so I might as well, go to town. And this sense too of like physical and psychological deprivation. So there's evidence that when people are deprived of a particular food, they end up thinking about that food a lot more. They end up wanting that food more, and then they eat a lot more of that food when they finally have access to it. And so, if something is off limits, it's like this siren song almost that you can't resist when you finally get around it and you just feel like you have to eat it all. And then that is really compounded by the fact that, if you're still trying to be on the diet, you're like, okay, well, tomorrow I'm going to buckle down.
Yeah,
Tomorrow I'm really going to stop eating this. And so it feels like, well, then tonight's my last hurrah. It's the last supper. I have to just get it all in now.
I'm gonna binge while I can still binge.
Mm-hmm.
So what are kind of the some of the physiological, let's talk emotional, physiological, psychological, kind of negative places we can go as a result of kind of fad diets? How can we hurt ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, there's, definitely the emotional stuff of feeling deprived, getting into that restrict binge cycle, beating ourselves up, feeling like we're terrible people with no willpower, that we can't control ourselves. And, that feeling of lacking self-efficacy is really harmful psychologically. Like, self-efficacy and feeling like you're in control of your life is really a key component to well-being and to happiness and to feeling fulfilled in life. And so when you're made to feel like a failure and that you don't have that capacity to control what you eat, and that you don't have any willpower, it really takes away that sense of self-efficacy. It takes away the sense of autonomy too,
Mhm.
because we're giving over our autonomy to something like a diet that's telling us how we should be eating and then telling us we're failures and that we don't measure up. So I think diets have a hugely negative psychological impact in that way. That's to say nothing of the impact of just the anti-fat bias that's
Mhm.
there in the culture, right? The way that diet culture makes people feel like failures and feel terrible about themselves if they gain weight or if they're a certain size, and the shame and stigma that people experience really just goes up as they go up the weight spectrum. And so, for higher weight people, sometimes the reality is they can't go anywhere without somebody making a negative comment about their
Mhm.
weight, without, their doctor telling them to lose weight when they came in for like a broken arm that had nothing to do with it, or a cold or something. And so, finding ways to navigate the world and, you know, combat that stigma and feel like be able to be resilient in the face of that stigma and have support in the face of that, I think is really important too. And is another way that diet culture just really undermines people's well-being by stigmatizing them. At the physiological level, weight stigma and weight cycling, chronic dieting, can have really negative effects. So weight stigma and weight cycling both are independent risk factors for a lot of the things that get blamed on weight itself,
Mhm.
like heart disease, diabetes, early mortality, some forms of cancer. And so it's really interesting to think about that in terms of, people are blamed, like high weight is blamed for causing those conditions, but the stigma and the weight cycling that people experience in an effort to escape being higher weight might actually be more at the root of those conditions
Mhm.
than the weight itself. And we do see in the evidence that people who are higher weight and stay stable and don't have large fluctuations in their weight, are generally better off physiologically, health wise, than people who have large fluctuations at whatever size.
So how do we so how do we kind of decide, um, I need to make changes to my diet? What should those changes be? What should my perception of them, the desired outcome, kind of setting things that are obtainable and reasonable as opposed to, hey, this fad diet says I can lose, 30 pounds in the next 2 weeks.
Yeah.
That's not the answer. But like, how do we set, how do we decide, do I really need to do something concerning my diet? And if I do decide I need to do something about it, what should realistic expectations be?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, first of all, like you said, asking yourself, do I really need to do this? And why am I thinking I need to do this too, right? What is it that's made me think I need to change my diet? Is it something I read, that I heard? What is the messaging that is sort of leading me to have this feeling? Is it, looking in the mirror and seeing something I don't like about myself? Is it, seeing a picture? Is it, a doctor told me something that maybe is something to listen to, or a doctor told me something because they're stigmatizing me for my size, but actually they don't, unfortunately, doctors, as much as they're experts in a lot of areas of physiology, don't really have expertise in nutrition,
Hmm.
and really don't study nutrition often at all in medical school. And so they might make assumptions, or have ideas about like how a person is eating based on their size. I've heard clients say, yeah, my doctor told me I need to like lay off the, donuts, but I haven't eaten a donut in years or
Yeah.
something. It's like, so just, not taking that information, kind of taking that with a grain of salt, and realizing that, your body, and You don't need to let these outside forces necessarily influence how you think about yourself and your relationship with food. If you're wanting to change how you eat because of feeling like you're in a restrict binge cycle, you have a disordered relationship with food, you know that something isn't right in your relationship with food. I remember myself kind of having that inkling and feeling like, oh, it's really not normal that I can't control myself when I get around a plate of cookies at a party, and I'm trying to be so good and I'm so quote unquote healthy the rest of the time, but when I'm faced with those foods, I just can't stop, and like that seems to be a problem. If that's the case for someone who's listening to this, I think thinking about your relationship with food in a more holistic sense, not just like, well, I'm so good all the time and then I'm so bad when I eat all that food. It's like, okay, looking at it from the sort of larger perspective of that's a cycle. That's the restrict binge cycle at play, or that's disordered eating at play, and the fact that you're trying to be so controlled with what you eat might actually be leading to these response, these rebound outcomes that are not what
Almost
you
what
want.
you're trying to solve for is actually causing the problem.
Exactly. And that's the case with so many people I see who think, they'll come to me and say, I want you to help me eat better. And I'm like, okay, what's at the root of that? Like, why do you think that you're not quote unquote eating well in the first place? For some people, there is, a self-care issue at play. Like they are working a really stressful job and all they have time for is fast food, or all they can afford is fast food or something like that. Right. And that's sort of a logistical and like economic issue. And so looking at like, what are the things that you actually have control over in your life, right? If it's an economic issue, there's probably not going to be that much control actually that you have. And not demonizing yourself and
Hmm.
shaming yourself for the food choices you're making, I think is a good start, because, you need to do whatever you can to take care of yourself in the situation you're in. If it's a self-care issue of like you don't have time at your job, things are too stressful, you're constantly, racing from one thing to another, you can't even leave your desk, like that's a problem, right? That's something to think about managing in your workplace, think about kind of the work life balance that you want to have and the self care that you really need and deserve. And it's not so much a food issue, and
Yeah.
it's not so much an issue of like, oh, I really am so bad because I'm eating all this fast food. It's like, well, no, it's an issue of how can I adjust my life and sort of take care of myself in ways that make it so that I don't have to just depend on that all the time.
Yeah. And I think that's actually a good place to wrap up in terms of there isn't going to be a this is the one solution for that'll
Mm-hmm.
work for everybody. This is the one plan, because everyone's relationships with food are different, with their diet are different, their lifestyles are different, and that kind of needs to be brought into the equation. It's not just
Mm-hmm.
what you're eating and how much of it you're eating.
Right. It's how you're relating to food and how you're relating to health and wellness in general. And, what you've got going on in your life and your well-being sort of that's leading into that, right? If you're, trying to solve a self-care issue by beating yourself up over what you eat, maybe it's helpful to pull back and look at the bigger picture. If you're trying to solve, a binging issue by doubling down and being even more restrictive with food, it's helpful to pull back and say, okay, actually, that's what's driving the binging in the first place. And maybe I need to ease up actually in the rest of my life and sort of find more balance overall so that I'm not in this, pendulum swinging back and forth situation.
Yeah. And this is by no means, we can't cover your 10 years of your 20 years of reporting and talking about this subject in 48 minutes.
Sure, right.
This is definitely not meant to be this is your one answer, but to open up
Hmm.
a wider discussion, I suppose. So
Totally.
if people want to learn more about, kind of rethinking wellness and the traps, I know you've got your podcasts. What are your podcasts again?
Yeah, so I have the podcast Rethinking Wellness. That's the one I'm doing now, and it's looking at, diet culture, disinformation, dubious diagnoses, scams, all the stuff that's going on in contemporary wellness culture, and that's so pervasive. And how we can recognize those things, not be duped by the scams, and find true well-being. People can find that at rethinkingwellness.substack.com or wherever you're listening to this. And I also have a podcast, Food Psych, that I did for 10 years that's still all all the archives are available, that looks at, recovery from disordered eating and finding a more intuitive and peaceful relationship with food. And that's also wherever you get your podcasts. And then the book is called The Wellness Trap, and you can get that wherever you get your books, or on my website. I have a list of lots of places you can get it at christyharrison.com/the wellness trap.
And we'll make sure to link to all those. I know that you have a great following over on Instagram. What's your Instagram channel?
Yeah, it's at Christy Harrison. It's the first I is a one, so CHR1STY Harrison. I'm not super active on Instagram anymore because of so much of what I've learned in my reporting about social media and the harms of it. And personally, I feel like it's really affected my mental health to be on social media. So I've taken a big step back and felt like that's been really healing and helpful for me.
Well,
But my
we won't send
archives
people
are
there
still
then.
there, and people can check it out if they want. To have lots of stuff there if you happen to be on Instagram. And I would encourage people to take a social media break as well.
We'll edit out that portion. Yeah, there's definitely the science behind social media is disturbingly alarming.
Yes, I'm sure as someone in this tech space,
Yeah.
probably far better than I. Yeah.
So we'll definitely put links to the podcast, the book, and the website, but maybe not the Instagram account in the show notes. So if people want to find those and not have to fumble for them online, we'll definitely include those. Christy, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you so much, Chris. It's really lovely to talk with you.